Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Thanks a lot for coming. It's kind of we're wrapping up this very intense week between Climate Summit and Climate Week. So we appreciate that people are sort of slowly kind of getting ready to go back home, but hopefully we're going to have more people trickling in. So my name is Raffaello Cervini. I'm introducing this session. I'm a lead environmental economist with the Climate Change Group of the World Bank. And it is my pleasure to sort of start this session, which is tackling a very important issue financing the energy transition. And of course, energy has been, finance has been a highlight of this week in a number of different discussions. Clearly, it's a very important topic. And when it comes to energy, it's particularly important that we know that energy is a key driver of Africa's growth and development. So the question on how we finance, energy, but which is also sort of low carbon and climate resilient, and what are the appropriate mechanism and vehicle for doing that. So we're going to structure the discussion in two parts. We're now starting with the first part of the session, which deals with the role of concessional finance in facilitating and supporting this process of transitioning towards a affordable and universal and clean and resilient energy for the continent. So it is my pleasure to start the session and welcome the panelists. We have a very distinguished panelist, including Ms. Lebogang Mulaisi. Maybe I can ask the panelists to join us here at the podium as we get started. She's the Chief Operation Officer of the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. We have Mr. Simbini Tishakunda, who goes, I think, by Tish. Is that correct? He's the Principal Program Officer for Energy in the African Union Development Agency, also known as NEPAD. And we also have Brian Mainza, who's online. I hope he can hear us. He's the Principal Energy Officer with the Department of Energy in Zambia. He's connecting us remotely. We also have Wendy Hughes, our Regional Director for Infrastructure in the East and Southern Africa region with the World Bank. And last but not least, we have Rahul Kichlu, who's the Practice Manager for operationalizing climate change in the Climate Change Group with the World Bank. So Rahul, I'm going to hand it over to him, who's going to be moderating the session. He's going to provide some introductory remarks and then continue with the moderation of the panel. Please stay in for the second part of the session. We're going to have another very sort of eloquent panel, which we're going to be introducing in due course. And the second part is going to be dealing with the role of carbon finance and carbon markets in further supporting the transition to energy. And of course, that's a very important complementary sort of approach because there is important aspects that are going to be dealt with in the session, looking at the role of concessional finance. But then, of course, a lot of opportunities might come in from carbon markets, and we're going to learn what has worked, what does not work, and how can we overcome the obstacles in the past to secure sort of a speedier and a more efficient transition and accelerating energy access in Africa. So without further ado, let me now turn to Rahul for setting the stage and moderation. Thank you.
Thank you, Raffaello. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this session, and really great that you could join us here in person, online. It's the last day, as Raffaello was saying, and as the tradition holds, we are keeping the best for last, talking about financing energy transition, a topic very near and dear to all of our hearts. And I think it's not a secret to anybody how energy sector and energy transition is really the central topic when we think about climate action and climate agenda. It's not just because it is the most emittive sector, but also the implications it has to development and growth, particularly in the context of Africa, where we are sitting and discussing this topic today. So on one hand, we have challenges related to managing the emissions and net zero pathways and energy transition. On the other side, countries are struggling with expanding access, providing energy security for development and growth needs. I would put a third challenge in the mix is ensuring affordability. So if you think about how these three challenges, energy transition, energy access, and energy affordability, have to be addressed, one of the underlying factors is the availability of financing. And financing is a catchphrase which quite often is misunderstood as just availability of money, or in banking terms, liquidity. If I ask for $100 in borrowing, it's not just the $100, it's also the cost and the tenor and the nature of that borrowing that matters as well. So while the needs, financing needs for energy transition are large in terms of just the numbers, but it's also the nature of that financing that matters quite a bit in terms of the concessionality, the tenor, the types of risk tolerant investments that are going in. So these are the topics that we wanted to explore with our distinguished panel today that have so much experience, practitioners from the field, strategy makers, government representatives. So thank you very much, panel, for joining us today on this very important topic. Before we get started, let me please invite Wendy Hughes, our regional director, to make some opening remarks and set the scene on the way World Bank sees the topic and how to address some of the challenges and opportunities.
Oh, it's on. Sorry. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It's really a great pleasure to be here. As Rahul said, I'm just going to make some opening remarks to set the stage for this very interesting discussion. Our choices today and in the next few years will determine the planet experienced by generations to come. A more secure, resilient, and clean energy future will require a major transformation of our economies, industries, and daily lives. But failing to act now risks locking the world into a path with dangerous consequences for both the global climate and especially for development progress. Decisions being made in developing economies are particularly important, where on a per capita basis, energy consumption is quite low generally now, but it is rising very fast. Electricity consumption in emerging and developing countries is set to grow about 3 times the rate of growth of the advanced economies. And the low cost of wind and solar power in particular should make these the technologies of choice to meet rising demand if the infrastructure and regulatory frameworks are in place. The challenge is to find development models that meet the aspirations of the citizens while avoiding high carbon choices that other countries have pursued in the past. A massive surge in clean energy investment in the developing world can put emissions on a different course. Annual capital spending on clean energy in these countries needs to expand by more than 7 times to over $1 trillion a year to put the world on track to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The transformation begins with access for all, reliable clean power, grids, and energy efficiency, but it has to encompass all parts of fast-growing and urbanizing economies. Clean power is, of course, central to development and transition strategies, but cannot provide all the answers in economies that are undergoing rapid urbanization and industrialization. Phasing down coal-fired electricity generation, transitions in transport fuels and energy-intensive sectors, for example, construction materials, chemicals, and shipping, are all essential to achieve deep emissions reductions. Energy transition is more complex than many people realize. For instance, coal is deeply embedded in the economies and livelihoods of some countries. We all, think about the workers who will need support for a just transition, but often it goes beyond just the workers. It's the communities and sometimes the whole regions that are depending on coal in one way or another. And support to make the transition is really essential for this to move forward in a just way. Transitions in the developing world must be built on energy access, both on-grid and off-grid, and on affordability. There are almost 800 million people who do not have access to electricity today, and about 500 million of those are in Africa, and about 2.6 billion people who do not have access to clean cooking options. Smart use of public finance will need to come with much more private capital. Mobilizing capital on a much larger scale will require a dramatic increase in the role of the private sector, and an enhanced role for development finance institutions will be critical to catalyze this investment. In a more capital-intensive energy system, the cost of capital is key. The affordability of clean energy transitions will depend on reducing the cost and improving the availability of capital. The benefits of transitioning away from coal will be shared globally. The costs, therefore, should also be shared globally. Developing countries will not overcome the barriers to energy transition alone. The world needs to come together to catalyze affordable finance to strengthen economies and unlock clean energy and energy access. The World Bank and other partners play a critical role in supporting development countries with more affordable financing to overcome barriers at each stage of the energy transition. The higher the barrier, the more concessional support is needed. The World Bank has catalyzed over 20 billion in private investments in renewable energy generation in the last few years. This needs to grow exponentially with the foundational support of the World Bank and our partners. Thanks very much and look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for sobering yet inspiring words. I would say is it's a collective challenge in front of us to bring all of our creativity and innovation and focus on this topic. So let me turn now to my friend Tik from AU Nepal. Tik, you've been working quite deeply across the continent with many countries and public and private sector agencies. From your perspective, what are the types of issues when you talk about the need within energy transition and energy access in Africa, and what has been your experience so far?
No, thanks. Thank you, Rahul. I do appreciate that the subject matter that we are discussing is quite broad. Energy is broad, sources of financing are broad, so I'll confine my interventions to the electricity sector, and also in terms of finance to how we can leverage grants and concessional financing. So indeed, we've been working with the power pools under the framework of the African Union to develop a continental power systems master plan. And as you would know that in June 2022, the African Union launched the Africa Single Electricity Market. And the purpose of the Continental Power Systems Master Plan was to identify the key infrastructure that we need as a continent to establish that Africa Single Electricity Market. So we are at a stage now where we are concluding that study. We'll be concluding that with the power pools next week on Monday. But some of the key results that we see are quite provide us some insights in terms of what that energy access and that energy transition could look like from the African perspective. The first thing that we have observed is that if the continent is to achieve two objectives of universal access as well as industrialization at scale on the continent, we will need to have an exponential growth in our power generation capacity from about 266 gigawatts to about 1.2 thousand gigawatts by 2040. And if you look at the numbers, you realize that that's a huge leap that we need to do as a continent. And in order for us to do that effectively, renewable energy will have to play an important role. And we project that we'll need about 70% of the new additional power capacity would have come from renewable energies. That translates to about 723 gigawatts that we need to add in terms of renewable energies. But that will not happen in the absence of regional markets. And by creating regional markets, we can increase the penetration of renewables and as well as reducing the cost of doing that. Our projections show that by creating regional markets and increasing the penetration of renewable energies will reduce the cost that is needed for us to achieve universal access from about 1.9 trillion US dollars to about 1.3 trillion US dollars. So that is very significant. And by doing that, we'll create a market which is over about 136 billion US dollars in terms of what can be traded on these regional as well as continental markets. So which means that, to echo what Wendy said, we need to mobilize resources at scale. And for this, we are proposing two things that we can look at in terms of how we can leverage on grants and concessional financing. So in terms of grants, as you'd appreciate, we cannot continue to just depend on pure grants. We need to transition from that to reimbursable grants so that we can have revolving funds that we can then use for two things. The first one is to develop those regional electricity markets and platforms where we can trade power on the continent. And as I mentioned, that we have the potential to create a market of over, that is valued at over 136 billion US dollars. In 2019, the African Union member states made a decision that if we, to finance the operations of the union, we can levy a levy of 1.2% of eligible imports. So if we create those markets and we apply the same model, we are able to then generate additional revenue from the trade that will take place from those markets, amounting to about 136 million US dollars per year. And that can be used for so many things. We can use that for to create revolving funds for infrastructure development on the continent. But I think what is also critical is for us to then be able to leverage on creating project preparation financing so that we prepare those projects that are priority for us to enable to do that transition. So in terms of creating that project preparation financing, we need to do that at scale as well, in a way that so that we can reduce the time it takes for us to prepare the projects, to bring them to market from the long periods that we see in our conversation. Rahul, we were saying that it takes about 7 years. We need to reduce that. We need to reduce the transaction cost. We need to make sure that whatever resources are invested in that process, we have a high likelihood of creating bankable projects, because we can't afford to continue with business as usual. The second thing that we can do in terms of how we can leverage on concessional financing. One of the things that we think is that concessional financing is good because it's able to provide low-cost financing to de-risk some of the projects. But we need to reduce the tenors of the concessional financing. Use it now by developing mechanisms to recycle that concessional financing. And one of the things that we are looking at and that we would want to engage with our partners is to create renewable energy markets, and SAP is already looking into that. But those renewable energy markets could be buttressed by regional energy trading financial markets. And on those financial markets, we can come up with a lot of products that can help now to recycle that concessional financing and to de-risk renewable energy investment. For example, some of the products that we could look at are energy derivatives, where we can trade energy futures or options to de-risk the investment in renewable energies. We can look at ways of refinancing the concessional financing through mini-PEM concessional loans and issuing green bonds for those projects that would have been constructed and that would have been de-risked. We could also look at more broadly infrastructure bonds. We could also explore the possibility of creating power purchasing agreements-based securities that we can trade on these regional markets, and also build on that carbon trading markets on those regional markets. And in all of those instruments, they give us an additional revenue stream if we were to levy some of the trading that could come from those markets. And the other thing is that we can then determine the levy based on the energy intensity of the source of energy that is traded on those regional markets. So by doing that, we are leveraging and multiplying the impact that the concessional financing as well as these reimbursable grants can have in terms of enabling us now to then upscale investment in power generation transmission, also creating an environment for enabling an environment where we create a market for these renewable energy projects. So thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Tik. Some really interesting points in there. My takeaway from your intervention was there is no transition without transmission, as they say, and the centrality of regional power trade and power pool and power markets. Very interesting points also in terms of not just mobilizing financing, but equally focusing on lowering the cost of investments themselves, and how integrated system planning and action across the life cycle of development of a project is equally important as well. So thank you. Madam Level, over to you now. What has been South Africa's approach, particularly in the context of optimizing blended and concessional finance resources, if you can shed some light on that?
Thanks, Raul, and thanks for giving South Africa an opportunity to make a couple of reflections. I think the the journey in South Africa has been very interesting, especially with the introduction of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plans. And that's probably been one of the times where we've really been looking to capitalize, especially on concessional financing, and looking to how best make use of blended financing to ramp up our transition to a low carbon economy. I think what's really important to take into considerations is that countries like South Africa, and we're not unique in this, it's the same thing with countries in our region, there are fiscal constraints. And there are really tight fiscal constraints. So there's a really attractive value proposition in seeking out concessional finance as well as blended financing. Just one of the things that I think South Africa has done, which has been really important, is to kind of set up the necessary institutional arrangements to make sure that you can optimize some of this financing. I think the Presidential Climate Commission has been quite key to this process, but I think also the JET-IP Project Management Unit has been really important to, first of all, mobilize this financing. And I think mobilization of the finance, we're starting to find out, is the easy part. When you are keen, when you have policy certainty, it's really easy to mobilize the funds. I think creating the necessary institutional arrangements in order to be able to optimize those funds then becomes a bit of the tricky part of the equation. But I think definitely the JET-IP Project Management Unit has been really key in helping us to unlock some of the value propositions, especially when it comes to some of this JET-IP financing. It's been really important to craft, and I think this has been a part of the JET-IP's value proposition and their theory of change around the compilation of project pipelines, which has been really important. So how do you structure your project pipeline in such a manner that when you've mobilized the funds, the project pipeline is actually there and there's enough offtake to be able to implement projects at scale? I think that's been very important, and I think the Presidential Climate Commission has also responded to this need by creating the Just Transition Financing Mechanism, which I'll talk to in a bit. Because I think that what the experience is showing us is that when you've mobilized funds, everybody is coming up with various number of projects that potentially require those funds. But how do you identify the ones that can actually give you the type of impact that you need to make this transition to a low carbon economy happen, and happen at a rapid pace? And I think that's another thing that's really important, that you need to establish your project pipeline, you need to create the impact, but it also needs to happen at a serious pace so that you can take advantage of the opportunities. You talked about a 7-year turnaround timeline. I mean, that's too long. Things need to happen, and they need to happen quite rapidly. I think another thing that's been important in our case is that coordinating systems within government and establishing really good relationships with your stakeholders, that's been quite key. I think in the case of South, again, we're probably not even unique in this instance, is that the energy transition is a bit of a shock to our economy. It's a bit of a shock to our system. We have an economy that historically had an over 80% reliance on coal energy. And we're looking at seriously decarbonizing at a rapid scale. So these are some shocks to our economy. So it's definitely important to build in the necessary coordinations within government and stakeholders to be able to achieve very good successes. And I think South Africa has been really good at doing this with the requisite partnerships within National Treasury, as well as our Ministry of Public Enterprises, and as well as making use of Eskom, our power utility, as being the test case for how well to transition to a low carbon economy. I think what's also been important is that, especially within the just energy transition investment plans that have been developed, it has been important to socialize these within our stakeholders. Like I said, the decarbonization trajectory within South Africa is a huge shock to our economy. So getting society and stakeholders socialized, this helps the progress of your process to happen even faster when you have achieved significant level of socialization within, especially your key stakeholders. Wendy, in her intervention, talked about the fact that decarbonization doesn't just negatively, or it doesn't just have a potential to negatively impact your co-workers. It's a whole of community and all of society issue. So there is definitely a need to socialize your plans among society much better and bring along key stakeholders with the process so that you don't have any hindrances moving forward in terms of your implementation. For us in South Africa, this is very important. I mean, we have a culture of consensus seeking and consultation. So these are the things that we strive to do in order to make, again, and unlock potential quite quicker. There's also just this, one of the things that for us has been also important, I think, is around a number of proposals to change policy, regulation, as well as legislation. Our legislation and our policies, I think, have been built around our historic mineral energies complex. And so there's a number of regulatory changes that need to happen. And I think chief among this have been the Electricity Regulation Amendment Act, which has been amended and to an extent has allowed for the unbundling of the power utility into separate transmission, generation, and distribution. This has already taken place, and I know there's already steps in place to get the transmission entity established and implemented. There's also been there's also been just the need to also amend this act to allow for the private players to come in to be able to generate electricity, as well as the removal of any thresholds in terms of embedded generation. But there's probably a lot that needs to be done in terms of our regulation, again, if we're going to unlock the value that you need from concessional financing. And I think, just to touch on the last thing that I wanted to make reference to, is that for you to optimize, I think, concessional financing, and for you to optimize the blended financing, I think there's going to be a lot of work that's required on monitoring and evaluation systems in order to enhance transparency. Those are going to build the confidence of your investors. That's going to build as well the confidence of very important stakeholders around you. And I think this is also very important in the case for South Africa. And I think these are the things that, either the JET IP project management unit has been really important to try and establish, to make sure that at its core we strengthen the whole element of transparency. And I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lebo. I think the one takeaway from your intervention that you didn't explicitly mention but was implied is leadership, and how public sector, the governments, the Presidential Climate Commission really takes charge of reducing the fragmentation, coordination of institutions from the public side, having a common platform to overcome some of these challenges. So thank you very much. Let's go online to our colleague Brian from Zambia. And same question to you, Brian. What's been Zambia's experience in mobilizing concessional financing for energy access and energy transition? Can you talk about some of your achievements and maybe some challenges so far? Brian, I think if we can just stick to some verbal comments would be perhaps best. Thank you.
and we are positioned for power trading, but it's very difficult for us because we haven't been able to access enough financing from GFIs for us to do projects. So one of the issues that we've had as a requirement, I can give an example. We have a project such as GetFit. GetFit received some financing from KFW, but we haven't been able to utilize the financing as required because of the conditions that have been put by some of the financiers, because the financing from KFW was meant to leverage the tariff, but we still had to get developers elsewhere so that they can come and develop those energy projects, but they haven't been able because they feel that the environment that we have, the credit worthiness of our utility is not good enough for them. Perhaps our financial situation as a country hasn't been good enough for them to come and participate. So those are some of the challenges we've had. Yes, we are on a trajectory to recover in terms of the economy, and we expect that more financing is going to come, but we expected it to come much faster than the way it comes. Yeah, so these are some of the challenges that we've had, but we are doing everything possible to give a good light in terms of our operation, in terms of the utility and positioning as a country, and to get more of grant financing. But grant financing really is not what we position ourselves. We can get concessional financing, like one of the panelists has said, but I think it's a positioning that we have as a country which we need to resolve in order to access most of these. Considering our challenges, we really expected to get more of financing and increase our energy trade in the region. And some of the things that we wanted is not just on generation, also on transmission, because we cannot trade without proper transmission network. So in the sub-region, we need to enhance our transmission network, and that has to come from financing. We are struggling with the Zizabona project. We are struggling with projects that have to do with transmission into Congo, one of our biggest electricity markets. So there is quite a lot that can be done beyond having financing for generation. We also need a lot in terms of transmission network so that we can supply the southern region, considering our position in the region. So maybe for now, those are the comments I can make.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think some very important points there. Maybe we can. Thank you. Brian, maybe you can mute your line. Okay, that's great. So first, I think in terms of how do we, particularly within the context of Africa, overcome the challenges of smaller markets, smaller projects, and then how we can aggregate and provide consolidated support, whether it is on project preparation or integrating financing, mobilizing financing across a set of projects. And again, the point around integration into much larger regional markets and power pools and interconnection of transmission networks were brought in. Very important points. Let me turn now again to Wendy. Wendy, you've heard our regional institutions, our country representatives. What would you say is the World Bank's approach in helping countries to optimize the use of concessional financing in the regional context, especially?
Thanks. And I think a lot has already been said that I fully agree with. So maybe just to see what I can add to that. From the World Bank side, I think concessional financing is obviously limited, and it is far, far, far below what is needed for energy access and for energy transition. So I think this is sort of the fundamental thing that we need to keep in mind. So in terms of where to use it, how to use it, I think there are sort of three categories. One is really to make sure that concessional financing is targeted toward helping the poorest to gain access, to retain access, to be able to use the energy that they need for their daily lives and for their livelihoods. A second is, as we were hearing, the energy transition away from a heavy fossil fuel economy will have impacts on people, workers, on communities, on regions and countries. And I think there's clearly a need for concessional financing to be targeted because the global benefits of those are shared, and so some of the costs also should be shared. I think the third place to really target concessional financing is to catalyze other financing, because without doing that, then it's just impossible to see how the total investment need can be mobilized. So maybe just to give some examples of the kind of things that we're looking at on the World Bank side. On the energy access specifically, there's a 500 million people plus a bit in Africa at the moment who don't have access to electricity. Much more than that, you don't have access to clean energy. To clean cooking. And on the electricity side, clearly there's the increased access to grid electricity. There's also the off-grid space. In the grid space, I think a very key part of that is working with utilities to help them to strengthen utilities so that they can be more efficient and that they are able to roll out the grid in an affordable way to places that are within reach of the grid. Quite often we see distribution lines that are going past villages or that are in a village and not connected to households because there just isn't the financing or the concessional financing, so supporting that, but also working with utilities and governments to get the sectors conducive for the utilities to be able to collect sufficient revenues from those who can pay or from parts of the economy that can pay, and to use those efficiently. On the off-grid space, this is a prime area for bringing in private sector. There's a lot of work in countries and many supporting partners who are working on that. There are a large number of, maybe not a large, there's a significant number of companies that are very active in that space in Africa. And I think there's a big role to help with making financing affordable for some of these companies so that they can expand their access. And at the World Bank Group, we have an initiative called DARES, Distributed Access to Renewable Energy Scale Up, which is very much focusing on innovation and finding ways to make affordable financing with reasonable terms and reasonable tenors available to some of these private sector companies that are aiming to work on mini grids and distributed renewables. I think a lot has already been talked about in the transmission, including on the interconnection, and I couldn't agree more. This is also an area where the World Bank is really focusing. It's on the transmission investments, both within countries to strengthen their systems so that variable renewable energy like wind and solar, which is very site-specific, can be connected to the demand centers. But the interconnection with other countries, the regional grid, is absolutely essential to be able to tap into huge renewable resources, whether it's solar or hydro. Africa has some of the best untapped resources globally, and without strong regional grids, and not only the physical infrastructure but the trading arrangements also, without that it's just not possible to benefit from those resources. So this is another area. And lastly, we talk a lot about the wind and solar because their costs have come down so dramatically, but there's also a need for baseload renewable energy generation, and I think their hydro and geothermal in some countries, but quite a number of countries, obviously including this one, have some potential there. So really focusing, the World Bank is really trying to scale up its effort to work with countries on developing some of the renewable energies that can provide baseload to complement the grid and the interconnection and the variable renewables. Last thing I want to say is that when we're talking about sustainable energy sectors, there's the low carbon aspect and then there's the resilience aspect as well. And I think that the interconnection across countries is also very critical for the resilience for economies. So when countries have droughts and their hydro systems don't operate at full capacity, when they're hit by cyclones and key power plants are knocked out, having interconnections and being able to draw on supply from other countries who haven't been affected by those disasters can be a lifeline. And without that, we've seen in a number of countries how dramatic the effect can be in terms of load shedding or extremely high costs when other sources of emergency energy have to be tapped into. So I've already spoken a long time. I'll stop there, but I think that's sort of a little bit of the view from the World Bank. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. That was great to be able to bring so many different dimensions in a balanced approach. This goes back to my opening around, how do we tackle energy security and development, energy transition, as well as affordability holistically. So inspirational challenge ahead of all of us. We have about 10, 12 minutes, colleagues. Maybe I take a pause here and go to the audience. And I'm sure of all the great suggestions, ideas, innovations that you've heard from the panel this morning, there's a lot of questions, comments, contributions that you want to make. So let me invite anyone in the room here who wants to share their experience or ask a question to the panel. There are microphones on both sides of the aisles here. Yes, please, sir, over there. Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Msingo. I'm with the EV Charger. It's an electric vehicle charging infrastructure provider here in Kenya. In all the solutions that I'm hearing, the demand side, that is never discussed. And is that a solution? Is that a problem? In Kenya, we had the last mile project. And at the end of the last mile project, you had people using about electricity worth $2 in a month. So how do we grow that? Because you've spoken about the utilities. The utilities need to actually make money so that they could be able to survive. So I think the demand side is something that we usually miss. Maybe just your thoughts on that.
Excellent suggestion, sir. And I think we'll take maybe one or two more questions. And yes, please, madam.
Thank you very much and good morning to everyone. My name is Duduntlenge Thomasina from Eswatini. I'm just listening to the discussions and hearing what Wendy is saying pertaining the base load, which is one of our concerns. We're talking about geothermal energy and hydro as options for providing a base load. And we're talking about this at a time where talking about hydro specifically, it's also very vulnerable to climate change, and there is also an increasing demand on the water resource itself. So for countries like my own country, how do we address the issue of base load while moving away from fossil fuels? This for us is a very critical question that needs to be answered. And then my other question is, I think as we're speaking here, there is another event that is talking about energy and green minerals. Is our transitioning to renewable energy without other options, particularly such as your geothermal and other options, going to be sufficient to support our mining? And if not, what exactly are we supposed to do? Some of us are exploring going further into mining, especially because those minerals are still needed for the development. But how do we ensure that we have the energy to do that while decarbonizing? Thank you.
Thank you. One more. Yes, madam.
I'm Priscilla Jezi. I'm from the power utility in South Africa, Eskom. Actually, the lead negotiator for the World Bank first jet pilot in South Africa. So I just wanted to comment in terms of, I don't hear us talking about the financing gap that exists where it comes to the energy transitions. We know that the response of the finance regime to decarbonization or to climate change is to divest, from coal. And as Lebogang has said that in our case is over 80% coal. So the financing gap, obviously, we experience there is when the finance regime divests, and also they increase their investment in renewables. So what happens is that the funding gap between where you're starting to transition to where you're going to renewables. So there's lack of finance, tapping into the journey of transition. So the transition activities are not all well covered, and we always shy away from that emerging term of transition finance that is so important to bridge the gap in terms of the limitation of climate finance. So when we're talking about blending all those, it's important for us to achieve the transition, because climate finance alone, as crucial as it is, it's limited in terms of us achieving that. So I just wanted to add on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. So 4 very interesting points, suggestions raised. What I would suggest is we go quickly across all the panelists. You can respond to any one of them, or provide your concluding remarks. So how do we address transition finance and not just infrastructure finance? How do we address mining and minerals, which are part of the transition economy? How do we address baseload and resource and water needs, and balancing supply side investments with promoting demand side use cases as well, right? So those are the 4 points from the audience. Let's go first with my friend Tick, and then Madam Lebo, Brian, and then to Wendy. Tick.
Thank you. I'll look at the issues around demand, and then also just comment briefly about the transition. So when we were doing our projections as a continent, we are cognizant of the fact that we are coming from a very low base. We've got suppressed demand being caused by insufficient or unreliable power supply on the continent. And so we tried to project what that demand could look like in terms of what we would need to fulfill the need for industrialization, the need for mining, and the emerging issues around electric vehicles and demand that will come out from that. And we developed a methodology that looks into that and takes consideration of that. We also looked at the supply that will come from the demand that will come from on-grid as well as off-grid supply. However, we in order for us to be able to take advantage of all of that, assuming that we are able to provide adequate electricity, this has to be supported by policy interventions that will allow countries to attract investment, that the necessary investment to create that demand. Because there's a chicken and egg situation here. If you don't have adequate electricity, you've got suppressed demand. If you to attract investment, you need reliable electricity supply. So we need to then work in tandem with our principles, so that as much as we are pushing for increased investment in power generation, they should create that enabling environment to attract the investment that is needed to invest in the electricity sector, but also more broadly in the broader economy. The second thing that I also want to mention in terms of what we have observed through the modeling that we have done, in terms of the energy transition. If you look at what we are projecting, and if you look at some of the countries across the continent, they've got very, very, very low power generation capacity. And what we are proposing is 4 times the current generation capacity across the board, across the continent. We cannot call that an energy transition. It's a sustainable development path that we are proposing. Because however way you want to look at it, if you look at the 266 gigawatts that we have currently, it will be replaced completely by renewable energy sources, which include hydro, geothermal, wind, solar, and so from our side, this is an essential and a sustainable development path that we need to take, which is cheaper than the alternative. As I mentioned, if we continue with the business as usual, we will need about $2 trillion to achieve our aspirations as a continent. But by adopting this sustainable development path, we can halve that to about $1 trillion. And what does that mean? It means that we are able to achieve our goal of a universal access. We are able to do that without burdening our countries with a lot of debt. And in our case, I think it's something that is necessary if we are to develop our developmental aspirations as a continent.
Thank you. Madam Lebo?
Thanks. And I'll just quickly go into especially the demand side issues because I think they're very important. And I think in our engagements with stakeholders and communities, this is the one of the things that they are very concerned about. In the case of South Africa, the renewable energy independent power programs, from the first bid window to now bid window 6, what you've seen is that the cost of renewable energy technology has decreased dramatically. But the question that stakeholders want to know is that this decrease in technology costs, will that be cost reflective for the end user at the end of the day? And these are questions we need to take into serious consideration because there is no one that's going to shortchange themselves to make use of a cleaner energy source if it's going to be more expensive. And there is no cost reflection in terms of what the end user ends up getting at the end of the day. So I don't know if this is a question of policy, but it definitely needs to be a question of how we take these things into consideration because the goal here is energy access for all and affordable energy access for all, which are key issues for the African continent, I believe. On the question of critical mining, and I know we throw this a lot as an opportunity for South Africa, but I don't, and Africa as a whole, I don't think we've done enough work to actually identify where the pockets of opportunities are. I don't think we've mapped it out quite clearly as yet. And I know there's a lot of people that have been trying to develop some sort of thinking around, where the opportunities are and how quickly we can unlock those opportunities and at what time do we expect the demand to take off. Because I think we identify these opportunities, but we're not identifying, the uptake of demand opportunities and when we can then start to invest in some of these projects. And I think that's probably a gap that I definitely think is missing in some of the debate. With us in the South African case, even though, there is the work that we're doing with the coal-fired power stations, we believe that we'll continue to export coal until the demand drops. And we're already starting to see the drop in the demand. It's starting to happen already. It's happening at a drastic rate. But as we believe in exporting as long as there's demand, but again, like I'm saying, it's starting to drop. And I think it becomes the continent's responsibility to do the work of identifying the critical mining opportunities, but again, transitioning or trying to think about the issue of the demand when it comes to these critical energies. Definitely there is a need for transitional finance, and I think this is where concessional finance is supposed to be assisting us a lot more. And I think these are probably the developments and the innovations that are required because like what Priscilla's saying is absolutely true, is that you're not seeing the transitional finance being that explicit as what you're seeing in investment in infrastructure. Because ideally what concessional finance is supposed to be doing is to help us to unlock potential and catalyze future projects, because we're not supposed to be depending on concessional finance. We actually need to get to a point where we move on. And that won't happen if we don't finance transitional opportunities much better. And I think sometimes that does get lost in the conversation a bit. So those would be my brief reflections.
Thank you, Lebo. Mr. Brian, any quick concluding remarks from your side?
Thank you very much.
Wendy, over to you.
Thanks. A lot has already been said. I'm just trying to see what else I could add on that. I think one topic which we didn't really talk about very much is on the energy efficiency side. And it sometimes seems strange to talk about energy efficiency when there's so little energy around. People just need more energy. But when we listen to take on the expansion and from my remarks how much the demand is expected to grow, one of the aspects of keeping it affordable is to do it in an efficient way. So appliances are efficient, distribution and transmission systems are efficient. The efficiency part, if it can be built in from the beginning, will make a big difference in making the financing go as far as it can go and making the service affordable. If you look at other countries, I'm thinking in Europe, for a long time the efficiency wasn't a key part of it, and as economies grew, energy cost and use grew just in line with that. But with efforts on efficiency, there's been a real decoupling of that, and it came sort of late in the day. So I think with this the opportunity for Africa is because there is going to be a huge scale up, that doing it in an efficient way is really critical. And the one place where I really say we can see that already has had dramatic impact is on the off-grid space. If you remember, I don't know, 15 years ago, a solar panel was expensive, and what you could do with it was just run, a 60-watt bulb or something. Now, because of efficient appliances, all the way from light bulbs to television sets and refrigerators, one relatively modest size system can run a household with this fridge and with lights and even TV access, phone charging, everything. So that has become affordable because of improvements in the energy efficiency. So I think this is one piece that we need to keep in mind. And just one thought also on there was a question, I think, on the mining and how to be able to supply sufficient power to mines, especially mines that are aiming to produce green minerals that are necessary for the overall transition. So one of the things that we're starting to see in our discussions on the extractive sides is that the big mining companies increasingly want to market themselves as green, especially if they're trying to sell so-called green or transition minerals. If they generate those using a fossil fuel energy base, it sort of undercuts the greenness of the product that they're producing. So mining companies, big mining companies have in many cases made commitments to go to 100% renewables. They are investing themselves in some renewable energy, and they are very, I think, open partners for looking at ways to green grids that they will depend on. I think this is something that can also be viewed as an opportunity. There was the question from our colleague from Eswatini. I think this, the question for how do you get baseload if you don't happen to have geothermal or large hydro. I think this is very critical. And there, I think the interconnection comes in very prominently. And, I think it's been clear over the years that no country wants or should be dependent on all their electricity supply from one other, one source of import. I mean, that's not what you would call energy secure. But I think with Eswatini is in a position, and many other countries, if you're interconnected in a network, then you're not just dependent on one other country, you have the whole network. So it gives you a level of options that can really balance, even if you haven't got the full amount of generation capacity internally. But also looking at complementing smaller systems can be very effectively developed with smaller scale energy generation. So it doesn't need to be one very large hydropower plant or something. It could be distributed smaller scale systems, which can also be very well integrated with water management, which is a super important issue that's also becoming more prominent with climate change. I think we're at time, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. A fascinating conversation. Look, clearly the needs are enormous for energy transition, and it's not just energy transition, it's sustainable development. It is part of economy-wide transitions. We need to do a lot in terms of not just mobilization of resources, but really targeting of the resources as well is important, which we heard today. It's about de-risking not just particular projects, but de-risking the sectors where each leg of the value chain, there may be hurdles and bottlenecks to overcome. We heard very good comments about how coordination, leadership is necessary to bring all the key stakeholders, decision makers, public and private sector on the same stage, aggregate resources and pool of available supportive sources and projects both on the supply side and demand side to make progress on it. And then finally, I think the roles that we all have to play collectively. It's not just pointing fingers to public or private or DFIs, etc. This is a collective challenge in front of all of us. And while resources are limited, concessional resources are limited, there's a lot that can be done even within the context of what we have today in terms of proper policies, planning, integrated system approaches, guarantee instruments, other innovations that we have heard. So let me thank all of the panel members for their contributions and expertise. Thank you for audience for listening and participating intently. And we transition back to Raffaello to continue this conversation on carbon markets, which can be a very important facilitator for leveraging financing for energy transition. So thank you very much, colleagues.
Thanks, Rahul, and thanks to all the panelists of the first part of our session. We now have the second part. We need to act rapidly because there is a lot more to be said. We have actually more panelists. So let's get started. As Rahul said, the second part of our meeting today complements the first one and looks at the role that carbon markets and carbon finance can play in this complex challenge and very important challenge for African development of the energy of the future, the kind of a more affordable, universal, and cleaner energy of the future. I just wanted to remind ourselves that one of the main reasons we're here is to contribute to the global stock take. So I think it's very important that we already got some input, but I think I would emphasize even more for the second session. Let's make sure that we organize a discussion in a way that can provide two key inputs to the global stock take, namely what has been the experience so far, what have we achieved, what have been the challenges and the shortcomings, and the forward-looking part, what are the solutions that we need to be able to include in the global stock take so that the whole UNFCCC process can have the elements and the insights to move forward. So let me just quickly move to the second part, and let me introduce the